Alrighty. Well, it is just after 11 o'clock, so I think we will go ahead and get started with at least the introduction part of the program. And if anyone else jumps in, we will let them into the program. I want to thank you all for joining us for our last installment of Winter Storytelling, or spring/summer storytelling, here with Travelers Rest Connection and Travelers Rest State Park. My name's Macy McPherson. I work for Montana State Parks, and I'm filling in for Molly Stockdale with Travelers Rest Connection today. Her son graduated high school yesterday, or today. They're graduating high school today. So she is not around. So I'm your host for today, and I'm excited to be here, and so excited that you guys all joined us. As we get started, I think, reading everyone's names on here, I think you guys have been to Winter Storytelling before this year. But if anyone has any questions about Zoom or questions for our presenter today, there is a chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you take your cursor to the bottom, you'll see a little chat box. Feel free to put any questions or comments in there, and we will moderate them and bring them up to Christopher in the program. We like to, for all of our programs here at Travelers Rest State Park, we like to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the Bitterroot Salish people. And the main reason behind the Winter Storytelling event, as many of you know, is it follows the Salish tradition of telling stories in the winter months. Traditionally, the Salish would tell stories, in particular coyote stories and other creation stories, when snow is on the ground. And this time of the year, we don't tell coyote stories, we don't tell winter stories, or the Salish don't for these programs, but we have continued telling other types of stories. So it's a great part of tradition here at Travelers Rest State Park, and we're very excited that Christopher has decided to join us today for the program. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Christopher Preston teaches environmental philosophy at the University of Montana in Missoula. He's the author of several books, including The Synthetic Age, Outdesigning Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-Engineering Our World. Much of his research connects to the idea of the Anthropocene, the epoch in which human influence is everywhere. He studies emerging technologies for their impact on the human nature experience, as well as restoration and rewilding efforts. And today, Christopher is going to talk about wild nature and how it fills the mythology of the American West. Is the wild disappearing? So a great wrap up to our storytelling series this year to talk about the wild part of Montana, the wild part of our nature. And I think we're all really excited to hear what Christopher has to say. So thank you so much for joining us, Christopher. I will let you jump in here.
Thanks for the introduction, Macy. They say it's always important to have a sense of your audience. And the problem with Zoom talks, and I've done a few now, is you have no idea who's out there. You sit here in front of this screen and you just hear your own voice resonating. So I have a poll question, which Macy, can you cue that up right now? Because I want to know who's local. So if you present that poll and you could answer that, yes or no. And then maybe can you also write into the chat where you're from? Just so I get a little bit of a sense. I expect there's a few of us from around here and a few from elsewhere. So I think we can, in a minute here, share the poll. Stevensville, Missoula, Helena, Hamilton. Okay, quite a few local people. So that's good. Thank you for letting me know that. Now, I'll just get my screen shared with you because I have some slides. Okay. So I'm from Missoula, Montana, but that's actually not quite true. I'm from England, Sussex, England, and I'm going to make some reference to England later in the talk. So I wanted to get that clear. And I do environmental philosophy. And I want to just say a little bit about what environmental philosophy is. Environmental philosophers are interested in environments, right? That's the environment part. So we're interested in animals, but they're also philosophers. So they sit there and they say, what does it all mean? So we talk and write about human-animal relationships. We think about shifting patterns. We think about big changes, and we think about what it all means. And that's what I want us to do today, is I want you to look at this talk as thinking about what changing relationships with animals mean. And it's very much a future-oriented talk. I'm going to look towards the future and have us think about changes that are happening. But sometimes to look towards the future, you've got to start by looking into the past. And if you look at the history of animals on Earth, we all know there have been periods of great extinction. So this is 500 million years of history of life on Earth. And there have been 5 peaks. So, extinction rates go up and down all the time, but there's been 5 peaks, the 5 mass extinctions. And evidence suggests that today we're entering a 6th mass extinction. Now, I should be clear. I've added that little peak myself using my PowerPoint skills. It's way bigger than actually where we're at. We're nowhere near any of those previous 5 peaks yet, but we're on the way. And I want us just to kind of absorb this idea of being on the way towards losing a lot of wildlife. If you doubt that we're heading there, just look at the news for 5 minutes. There's all kinds of reports. I want to pick one statistic off this World Wildlife Fund Living Planet report in 2020. The top bullet there, average vertebrate population size has declined by 2/3 since 1970. So if you go and look at all the different populations of vertebrates around the world, and you take the average decline in the number, literally the number of individuals in that population, that number of individuals has gone down by 2/3 in the last 50 years, which is really extraordinary. And it's statistics like that that lead people like Elizabeth Kolbert to say that we're entering the period of the 6th great extinction. Let's make that concrete by just thinking about a particular couple of animals. Let's talk about the American bison. So it's estimated that there were between 30 and 60 million bison in 1850. Let's split the difference and say there were 45 million bison in 1850. And let's say that the average bison stands 6 foot at the shoulders. Let's make a stack of bison, all 45 million of them. This is going to be pretty rough for the couple of bison on the bottom, but let's make a really tall stack of 45 million bison. That stack of 45 million bison would stretch 9,300 Everests into the sky. Now, it's hard to imagine that. So let me give you this little statistic. The International Space Station, orbiting the Earth right now, is orbiting at 40 Everests high. So that stack of bison would be more than 200 times as high as the International Space Station orbits. That is a lot of bison. And those bison get reduced over a period of about 50 years to something like 541. And I always think that's funny that that number is so precise when you go from 45 million down to 541. But we know that was pretty much right, because William Hornaday, who was working for the National Museum, actually went out west and almost literally counted them all. I mean, he probably didn't point a finger and make a note of every single one, but he got a very good handle on how many bison there were in the 1880s, 541. And they continued declining to about 300 around the turn of the century, less than 20 even in Yellowstone. So at that point, when there's 300 bison left, instead of having 9,300 Everests, we've got 1/16 of an Everest of bison. Just an astonishing crash. Let's look at another crash, passenger pigeons. It's thought there were 5 billion passenger pigeons in 1800. How big a number is 5 billion? Well, if you put those passenger pigeons nose to tail, all 5 billion of them, and you wrap them around the Earth, they would wrap 38 times. That's an enormous amount of biomass on the planet. And that biomass gets wiped out again in about the same period, roughly 50 years or so, getting shot, getting netted. And there were so many passenger pigeons originally You could kill them by waving a big stick in the sky and just hitting enough passenger pigeons that you had enough to eat. So just an astonishing kind of slaughter of wildlife. And that century, from about 1800 to 1900, that century is a period of undeniable decline, especially in North America, but certainly in other parts of the world too. And I've picked these two images deliberately, perhaps to illustrate a particular point. In 1806, when Lewis and Clark are at Traveller's Rest on their way home and also on the way out, notice in that picture on the bottom left, Lewis and Clark are paying close attention to Sacagawea, who is helping them recruit guides. They're looking at the indigenous people as the experts on this landscape. That's in around 1800. In 1903, we've got the famous photograph of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir standing on Glacier Point in Yosemite. And I tell my students here, in some ways we look at that photo and we say what vision these early environmentalists had. But I think in other ways, what we can see about this photograph is they have totally forgotten at this point the wisdom that indigenous people brought to the business of protecting the landscape. I mean, they're literally looking over and looking past the indigenous people that they helped remove from that landscape to protect places like Yosemite. So it's an interesting connection, I think, that corresponds with that decline in animals. So in North America, we might say the turn of the century was the low point. The bison hung on, the passenger pigeon didn't. Other animals also reached their low point round about then. The beaver actually reached the low point perhaps a little bit before then. The grizzly bear probably a little bit after then. But certainly that turn of the century period was kind of a period where the story, in some regards, changes direction. So this is where I'm done looking backwards and I'm going to start looking forwards. And before I start looking forwards, I want to make one thing clear. Quite a lot of what I say from now to the end of the talk is going to be about positive stories of wildlife and about wildlife return. And I think those positive stories are worth exploring. I don't want anybody to leave this talk thinking that my impression of wildlife in the United States or around the world is that it's doing great and it has no problem, because I would be a fool to suggest that. In most regards, for most species, there's still incredible pressure on wildlife. But what I do want to do is I want to look at a few cases where things have gone well, because as a philosopher, I think there's quite a lot to learn from those cases. And I think those cases provide hope, and perhaps they provide vision for where we might head in the future. So I'm going to start talking about wildlife return. But you know what? I'm not going to call it wildlife return. I'm going to call it rewilding. And I think rewilding is an interesting term. It's bigger than just saying wildlife return or wildlife recovery. It includes a larger philosophy about a human relationship to the landscape. And so I want to spend the next 5 minutes just defining a little bit what rewilding is and what this term does for us philosophically. So here's a definition of rewilding, and it's actually by a British environmentalist. Rewilding, I tell you, is all the rage in Europe at the moment. So I'm going to quote this British rewilder, George Monbiot, and look at the things that he says rewilding is about. It's resisting the urge to control nature. So it's kind of relinquishing a little bit of control. It involves trusting nature to find its own way a little bit. Sometimes you're going to actively go in and you're going to reintroduce animals. Sometimes you're going to actively go in, you're going to rebuild things, pull down dams, pull down fences, unblock drains. But other times you're just going to step back. So rewilding is a multifaceted idea of letting go, nudging things on in a certain direction, undoing some of the harms that were done before, but also trusting in nature and trusting in wildlife to find its way back. Let me go into a little bit more depth about what rewilding is. You can have different targets with rewilding. You can be thinking of it in terms of a species, one particular species you want to see come back. Or you can think of it in terms of a process. You want to see a process come back. You want to see the landscape burn again, or you want to see it flood, or you want to see it erode. You want to see those natural processes back in place. Let me give you another divide in rewilding, the divide between rewilding deliberately and rewilding spontaneously. So deliberate rewilding is where humans actually go in with a plan. They reintroduce species, they bring in equipment to recreate what they perceive to be natural conditions. And then there's spontaneous rewilding, where you literally just step back and see what happens. So you don't have a plan. You just stop controlling a landscape and you let that landscape come back. So deliberate rewilding is going to involve machinery, it's going to involve cages, it's going to involve person hours, bringing in wildlife, monitoring it. It's going to involve technology, transmitters, GPS. It's going to involve banding released birds. This is all very deliberate and concerted. Spontaneous rewilding, on the other hand, usually just involves a change in law. So a different hunting rule, a different rule about pesticides, let's say, a different law about a particular patch of landscape. And when you allow spontaneous rewilding to happen, the animals just find their way back. Now, I make this distinction between deliberate and spontaneous, making it sound like this is a really clean distinction. You either do it deliberately or you do it spontaneously. In reality, most of the time, it's both. Most of the time, you've got a little bit of management, a little bit of a plan. And then on top of that plan, you have these spontaneous, surprising things happen. So I've got a couple more things I want to say about rewilding, just to get us into the philosophy of rewilding. Sometimes you don't have the species that you want to bring back on the landscape because the species has gone extinct. And that's the case in Europe. So the auroch, which was the dominant herbivore, the largest grazer shaping the landscape in Europe, that's been gone since 1627. So what do you do if you want to rewild? You can't hope for aurochs to come back. Well, what you can do is you can put a surrogate on the landscape. So the surrogate here is a type of cattle called the taurus, which has been deliberately bred to be as close to the auroch as possible. What these European breeders did is they looked at the genetics of some of the wilder breeds of cattle on the landscape, and they crossbred them, and they got something that looked more and more like an auroch to perform more and more of the same function. So you're rewilding here with a surrogate. There's other possible surrogates as well. We're not going to get the woolly mammoth back, but maybe one of its close relatives, the Indian elephant, could perform similar ecological functions to the woolly mammoth. And there's actually biologists at Harvard experimenting with putting the genetics of long winter hair, for example, into Indian elephants, or putting the genetics for cold tolerance into Indian elephants. So this is an attempt to make the Indian elephant a better surrogate for a woolly mammoth than it currently is. And myself, I have some concerns about that sort of activity, but it does give you a sense of how you might rewild in ways using technology that you could not have imagined before. Okay, so that's a little introduction to rewilding. And like I said, I think rewilding is a richer term that we can use for some sorts of animal returns. Let's now do a couple of cases of animals that since that 1900 low point have done surprisingly well. So let's go back. Oh yeah, I had one more point to make about rewilding actually. And this point emerges from using Taurus instead of an auroch, or using an Indian elephant instead of a woolly mammoth. If you call it rewilding, that suggests that what you've got in mind is the woolly mammoth or the auroch, because the rewilding suggests you want to look backwards into the past. And some of these rewilders think, you know, that's the wrong image. We're not actually trying to go back into the past. So let's drop the rewilding prefix and let's just call it wilding. maybe wilding is a better term, where you're allowing for a future that isn't trying to mimic the past. It's different in important ways. And it's a more flexible vision of a future in which nature does take a more leading role, but we're not really exactly setting strict guidelines for what that future will look like. Okay, that now is the end of my little rewilding philosophy summary. So let's go to some animals that have come back pretty well. So those bison, do you remember they were down to 300 at the turn of the century at that low point? They're up to 530,000 today. So that is over a 1,500-fold increase from where they were at before. And the story of recovery is pretty interesting. And the story begins with Atatitsa and little Falcon Robe, who brought some of the last remaining bison over the mountains from their hunting grounds in Blackfeet territory, over the mountains into the Flathead Valley in the early 1870s. And there's a wonderful 30-minute documentary, which you can find on YouTube, in the spirit of Atatitsa, which documents what happened to those bison. And the story is really interesting, and it connects up to today. And this is why I'm telling it. So that movie tells the story of Atatitsa and little Falcon Robe. Sometimes if you go to other sources, you get a slightly different story. There's a bit of a debate here about which story is the most accurate. But another story you might see if you look into this is that it was not Atatitsa and little Falcon Robe, but Samuel Walking Coyote, who was returning from Blackfeet country with his new Blackfeet wife, Sabine, and thought he should bring a sort of gift to mollify the elders back in the Flathead, because he'd been away for so long. So whether it's little Falcon Robe or whether it's Samuel Walking Coyote, these bison go from Blackfeet territory into the Flathead Valley in the 1870s. Not too long after that, they get bought by Pablo and Charles Allard, and that herd continues to live wild in the Flathead Valley until the federal government say the Flathead Valley is going to be open to settlement. And some of that land that had been reserved by the Hellgate Treaty in 1855 was declared to be surplus to Indian requirements. And so Pablo knew that that herd wouldn't be able to live wild in the Flathead, so he decided to sell it. He sold it to the government of Canada, rounded it up with some of the best cowboys in the region at the time. Those cowboys put the bison onto trains. It wasn't that easy to put the bison onto trains. The first set of bison that clambered up into a boxcar just walked to the far end of the boxcar and busted their way through and walked out the other side. But eventually, after 7 years of struggle, and here's a bit of that struggle, photographers would come from all around to see what was going on and to watch the roundup. And here's a butte photographer getting chased up a tree and losing his trousers in the process. When Charles Russell painted this, called it a close call. But after 7 years of drama, these animals made it into Canada, and they ended up living and multiplying in Elk Island National Park. And I want you just to remember that idea of Elk Island National Park and these bison that have come from little Falcon Robe through the Pablo Allard herd up into Elk Island, because they're going to come back into the story in just a second here. That's the bison recovery track that happened first. There's another recovery track that began a little bit later and was centered more on environmentalists on the East Coast. So that William Hornaday that I pointed out earlier had that count of 541 bison. He teamed up with Theodore Roosevelt. They helped found the American Bison Society. They also collected some of the last remaining bison, sometimes from private cattlemen who had set some bison aside because they sort of knew there was value in these diminishing herds. Some of those bison were taken back to the East Coast, and they were bred in the Bronx Zoo. A national bison range was established in 1908, and some of those bison from the Bronx Zoo were moved to the bison range. Some bison from the Conrad herd, which was another herd of privately held bison up near Kalispell, were moved into the bison range. And so there was this second track of bison recovery taking place. So you've got bison recovering in Canada, in Elk Island National Park. You've got bison on the Bison Range starting to recover. And by now also you've got bison in Yellowstone finally getting protection and starting to recover from less than 20 animals around the turn of the century. And interestingly enough, those Yellowstone bison were supplemented by some of the Pablo Allard bison. And so we talk a lot about how those Yellowstone bison are the last pure, genetically pure, free-roaming bison in the nation. But it is interesting to note that they had a little bit of supplementation from those Pablo Allard bison originally from the Rocky Mountain front. So there's the germs of recovery. There's the genesis of the recovery in the early part of the 19th century. Let's scroll forward to today, and we've got really an explosion of interest in bison recovery. Definitely the tribes are playing a leading role in this, and the Intertribal Buffalo Council represents 69 tribes, bringing buffalo back onto tribal lands. The very interesting bison return, for the sake of the story I'm telling here, is the one that began in 2016 on the Blackfeet Reservation, because the return of bison to the Blackfeet in 2016 represented those very same bison that Little Falcon Robe had brought across the mountains into the Flathead Valley, then north up into Canada, and then finally in 2016, some of those bison came back to the original place they were taken from. And if you think of that, if you just visualize it, that's a giant circle that's drawn over 140 years or so until those bison eventually return home. Other types of bison restoration that are taking place and relevant to us in this state are, one of them is on the American Prairie Reserve, where they currently have between 800 and 900 bison. The American Prairie Reserve is a vision for up to 3 million acres of protected land centered on the Charles Russell National Wildlife Refuge and the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, but patched together with other parcels of private land that the American Prairie Reserve are busy investing in. Sometimes they're buying the land outright, sometimes they're just buying the leases. And the 3 million acres that is part of this vision here will be 1.5 times bigger than Yellowstone. And bison, as big ecosystem architects, will play a huge role in shaping that landscape. So bison recovery has been really quite remarkable, from about 300 animals up to over 500,000 bison today. There is a little catch here though, and that catch is that 90% of these bison have some cattle genes in them. You can imagine early cattlemen looking at the resilience of bison, their ability to survive tough winters and to live through droughts, and saying, wouldn't it be great if my cattle had some of that? And so those early attempts at breeding bison with cattle have led to this enormous influx of cattle genes into wild bison. And in fact, of those 530,000 bison alive today, about 500,000 of them are in commercial herds. That means bred by cattle owners for market. Only about 30,000 of them exist to live as bison in a conservation type of status. All of those bison bred for market have cattle genes in them. And quite a lot of those bison that are in conservation status have cattle genes in them. So only 2% of bison, around about 10,000 animals, are thought to be genetically pure. And that story of those bison that Little Falcon Robe brought across the Rockies and into the Flathead Valley, and which ended up in Elk Island, that comes in here again, because those Elk Island bison are the source of something like 3/4 of the genetically pure bison in conservation herds today. So they have played an enormous role in the recovery of bison. So that's some of the genetics and some of the ecology, let me just, before we leave bison, put one philosophy question out there. You might think it's incredibly important to have pure bison. But moving forward, is it always going to be possible to have pure bison, and should it matter? That's a question I just want to throw out there, and we can return to that when we get into our discussion at the end here. Should it matter what the genetics of bison are? And given that we're in the Anthropocene, the human age, where human influence is everywhere, how much does it matter? How important is it that the bison genetics are pure? That's a question that I think is worth discussing. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more examples of recoveries. Let's talk about beavers, the world's second largest rodent. A couple of interesting facts. They have self-sharpening orange teeth. The orange is the iron, and the iron helps their teeth resist the acids in the wood that they're constantly gnawing. The self-sharpening is made possible by the fact that the structure in the front of their teeth is different from the structure in the back of their teeth. It's a harder type of enamel structure. And so when they chomp down into wood, the front of the tooth wears down more slowly than the back of the tooth. And that keeps a constant edge on the tooth. So they have these self-sharpening teeth. And then there's these tails. And I thought I would stop for a second. There are 5 uses that the beaver's tail has for the beaver. It serves 5 different functions, probably more than that. But I've got 5 different functions in mind. Can anybody unmute and just tell me some of those 5 functions of the beaver tail?
Slapping the water for security.
Yeah,
and
it's an
for
alarm.
balance. And the fur traders love to eat it, but that's not for the beaver.
So it's an alarm call. It's a balance. I think you said balance, right? It's a balancing device. If you're a beaver up on your hind legs and you've got a nice tail out there, it's like you got a tripod. Some people like to eat it because use 3, it is a fat storage device. Great place to store fats. Anything else? There's more. It's a rudder when the beaver is swimming. Perfect rudder, right? Imagine that. It's like a little boat with a rudder out back. And finally, it's a heat exchanger. There's a lot of blood vessels in there. And so that tail, you imagine the front of the beaver is all covered in fur, but you got that tail where you can have a much more effective heat exchange with the outside world. So it's a kickstand, it's a rudder, it's a fat storage, it's an alarm device, it's a heat exchanger, just kind of an amazing adaptation. Another adaptation is that its eyes and its nostrils are high on its head. So when it's swimming, it can keep its eyes and its nostrils above the water, and everything else is concealed and away from predators. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the beaver crash in populations, and then let's talk about the beaver recovery. From 400 million down to 100,000, and of course the reason was the fur, and specifically it was the turning of that fur into felt that made felt hats. And I have on the right of that picture the seal of the city of New York. And I don't know how easy it is for you to see from where you're sitting, but that seal of the city of New York has 2 beavers in it, indicating just how important that economy, that fur economy and that felt hat economy was to the establishment of the city of New York. So the beavers go down to about 100,000, round about 1850. And then the beaver gets a lucky break. Hat fashions change. That's all it took. Hat fashions change. And instead of hats made out of beaver felt, it was hats made out of Chinese silk. And once the dandies in Europe preferred hats made out of Chinese silk, the beaver had a lifeline. Now, it didn't bounce back right away, but the tide started to turn for beavers. And reintroductions began in the US in the 1920s. I've got a picture of one of the most interesting aspects of beaver reductions in the United States, the parachuting of beavers into the backcountry in Idaho. Each of those wooden crates has a beaver in it, and when it lands, it pops open. Or if it fails to pop open, the beaver's got the right teeth for gnawing its way out of there. And beavers were reintroduced into backcountry areas in Idaho successfully by parachute. Today, beaver reintroductions continue along with techniques for helping landowners live alongside beavers. And so devices like something they call a beaver deceiver are helping ponds from not flooding to the extent that the culvert gets overwhelmed and the road floods or the field floods. It keeps, a beaver deceiver keeps a little bit of water always flowing out of the beaver pond so that you don't get flooding. But beavers are recovering. And guess what? This is not just good for the beavers. This is incredibly good for us, because the list of ecosystem services provided by beavers goes on and on and on. And it's obviously a lot to do with water in terms of keeping water clean, keeping groundwater recharged, keeping water on the landscape instead of it ending up in rivers and in the seas. It's also good for ecology in terms of the diverse habitat, providing benefits for fish and benefits for insects, and just adding complexity to the ecosystem. So an enormous amount of services provided by the beaver. And let's think about climate change for a second, because we can think about the beaver as being an incredible tool during climate change. If you're from a wet place or a wet country, so my country of origin, the UK, beavers are getting reintroduced today for the purpose of flood protection, because the UK gets all of this water from the Atlantic Ocean, and as temperatures warm, there's going to be more and more water evaporating into clouds and bigger floods, and they're already seeing that in the UK. If you have a few beaver dams in the watershed, the water is kept up in the high country. It doesn't all end up in the river and then rushing out towards the sea, flooding those towns that usually are downstream and closer to the sea. So the beavers are a climate change tool in wet countries in terms of preventing floods. And in dry environments, they're also a climate change tool in terms of keeping landscapes wet. That's helpful for ranchers whose cattle benefit from that moisture later on into the summer. The complexity of the habitat helps sequester carbon through the growth of vegetation. And something else beavers do to creeks, which is really interesting, when there are fires, one of the dangerous consequences of fires is the runoff that happens after the next big rainstorm. That runoff ends up in the creeks, and the creeks, their pH changes dramatically so that it's hostile to aquatic life. A few beaver dams help mitigate that flood of ash into the creeks. And so a few beaver dams can help the pH of those creeks return more quickly to normal than if those beaver dams weren't there. And then this last climate change related benefit of beaver dams is, I think, made abundantly clear in this slide. Look at that strip of green down the middle, which is acting as a potential fire break. Now, I know in this picture, there's fire on both sides of the valley bottom here, but you can see how potentially a wetted area can act as a fire break. If you look at the very bottom of that picture, you can actually see the beaver dam. So right in the bottom of that picture, in the little pond, you can see there's a little beaver dam, illustrating another service that beavers provide for us. So I want to stop talking about beavers with another philosophical question. So remember, with the bison, the philosophical question was, genetic purity. What are we going to do with that moving forward as animals return? This philosophical question is a little different. Are we able to think of animals like beavers as partners in addressing some of the big challenges we face? So it's very easy to think of wildlife as kind of annoying. You know, you might have an image of beavers of flooding your land, or, you know, of wolves as taking your lambs or your cattle. It's very common to think of wildlife as being nice to look at, but a little bit of a pain when it comes to economies. Could we instead start to look at animals, and especially animals like beavers, not as kind of irritating and annoying and an economic cost, but look at them as valuable partners in the very real challenges that we face? I think that's an interesting question, and it's a question that we might have to ask moving forward. Okay, I got 2 or 3 more animals that are doing well. Here are the beaver numbers. In the US, we're back up to 15 million from 100,000. And that's an increase of 150-fold. But look at how well they're doing in Europe too. The absolute numbers are not as great, but the increase, over 1,000-fold increase in the amount of beavers in Europe. And as I indicated, reintroductions happening all the time. Okay, another return. Peregrine falcon, down to 324 pairs in 1970, up to 3,000 pairs plus today. We don't have a good handle on how many peregrine falcons there are today, because they got off the endangered species list and the mandatory counts no longer have to happen. But at least 3,000 pairs of peregrine falcons today. That was achieved in 2 ways. One was one of those law changes. So the banning of DDT. This is a quite famous story. The DDT was making it impossible for their young to hatch because the adults would crush the thin shells that the DDT caused. So in the one case, it was just a ban, a change in law, but also a very deliberate and intentional captive breeding program. So peregrines were bred inside where their food could be kept clean, and the chicks were then released outside through these very labor-intensive releases using hack boxes. And you can see in the bottom right there, a hack box. A hack box lets the chicks spend a few weeks outside getting fed by volunteers who don't show their faces. You can see that hack box has a tube coming out the top. The food would be dropped in through a tube so that the young wouldn't see that they were getting fed by humans. What the young would see is they would see that marvelous panorama off that cliff edge through the bars on that cage, and they would be imprinting onto that landscape. And then when their flight feathers had grown in, the front of that cage was opened up, and the young peregrines would start to make short excursions. They were still getting a little bit of supplementary feeding at this point, but they would start to make short excursions. The food was getting reduced, so they were getting hungrier and hungrier, and they would start hunting. And that was a successful strategy, and about 8,000 peregrines were released through hack boxes over a period of about 2 decades. And peregrines have recovered. It's a success. But there's a little wrinkle on that success, which brings me to another philosophical question for us. A lot of those peregrines were hacked in cities. Turned out they enjoyed cities. That the reason they were hacked in cities, there were a couple of reasons really. One of them was the first peregrines that were getting released on cliffs in their more typical habitat were getting nailed almost immediately by great horned owls. And so the biologists had put all these effort into raising them indoors, and as soon as they put them outdoors, the great horned owls were taking them. And so they thought, well, maybe if we released them in cities, there wouldn't be so many great horned owls, and those peregrines would survive. Another thing cities had going for them was pigeons. Plenty of pigeons and plenty of ducks. So these young peregrines were safe from great horned owls. They had a good prey base, and they flourished in cities. It was thought that those peregrines would then leave the cities and go back into their more typical habitat. They didn't. They liked cities, and they stayed in cities. And in a state like Wisconsin, 80% of the peregrines in Wisconsin today nest on human-built structures. So that means most of those peregrines are in cities. Some of those human-built structures they're not all going to be in cities. Some are going to be outside cities. But those human-built structures provide nesting sites for 80% of the peregrines in Wisconsin. So here's my third philosophical question. We got the question about genetics out there with bison. We got the questions about partners, looking at animals as partners with the beavers. And with the peregrine, we've got a question about whether it's okay for future recovered animals to live in environments that we don't typically associate with them. So the peregrine has been called a natural aristocrat. And it's a natural aristocrat because it flies so fast and it dives down these wild cliffs. What happens when the peregrine is actually living in cities and adapting to a different form of hunting strategy, living a different kind of life, becoming a different kind of animal? So we've got a successful recovery, but what's recovered is perhaps a different kind of animal. So I want to zip through 3 or 4 more recoveries right now before wrapping up with something else that I think is philosophical. So look at some of these numbers. Wild turkeys, from a low of 30,000 in 1930 to 6 or 7 million today. And just look at the explosion of numbers in Massachusetts and Vermont. Just an unbelievable recovery. Bald eagles. Bald eagles suffered the same fate as peregrines through DDT, the thinning of the eggshells. But look at these numbers today. This just came out a month or so ago. 71,000 pairs in the US now, after a change in law, a little bit of reintroducing, but the bald eagle did not rely as heavily on reintroductions as the peregrine did. The bobcats in the Northeast. So the recovery of forest cover in the Northeast has led to an incredible resurgence of bobcats by a factor of 10 in New England. If we go into marine environments, we also find remarkable recoveries. Northern elephant seals up to 125,000 today. Humpback whales, just look at some of those numbers. Western Indian Ocean population of humpback whales has gone from 600 to 36,000 in 5 decades. And it's estimated that humpback whale populations could reach pre-exploitation levels in another 10 years. So having been depleted by more than 95% through whale hunting, they could reach pre-exploitation levels in another 10 years. Not every humpback whale population is secure. There's 14 populations around the globe. 11 of them are doing well. There's 3 or 4 that are not doing so well. But this really is a remarkable sort of recovery. And then a couple of other recoveries that are not as dramatically successful, but at least are heading in the right direction. Black-footed ferrets, up from a low of 18 to 350 living wild today. Black-footed ferrets have challenges though, because the habitat and prey upon which they depend, the prairie dog habitat and the prairie dogs themselves, that habitat has been so diminished, and there are challenges with plague, sylvatic plague. So all of the black-footed ferrets released back into the wild have to be vaccinated, a topic on our minds a lot at the moment as well. But you can see this is a challenge still for black-footed ferrets. Sea otters doing very well in some places in California, for example. In Southeast Alaska, they're doing very well. Not so well in other places in the Aleutian chain. Sea otter populations have decreased. We're not exactly sure why, but there are these other promising species recoveries. So let me start to sort of bring some final philosophical thoughts to our conversation here. Here's a few things I want us to take from this. Some wildlife species can recover spectacularly, absolutely spectacularly. So look at those whales, look at those elephant seals, potentially look at those bison. Wolves are another one. Absolutely remarkable recoveries from those lows. On certain occasions, all it takes for that to happen is to stop killing them. And I think this is particularly striking in the case of the whales and the seals. All we had to do was to stop killing them, and they bounced back spectacularly. Now, of course, it's no good bouncing back spectacularly if you don't have adequate food sources. And there are some questions with the humpback whales, for example, who are filter feeders, and they rely on krill. Are those krill populations going to be adequate through climate change. So there are still some sort of concerns here, but there is things so far look pretty good. Sometimes in order to get those recoveries, you have to be pretty heavily involved, and there are some sorts of compromises. And so what I mean by compromises, there's a compromise issue with those bison, I think. There's also a compromise issue with the peregrine falcons, falcons living in cities, bison living with cattle genes. And so there are questions that kind of get raised there. I think it's very important not to forget that these recoveries have happened through the sort of intensive development of Western scientific techniques, yes, but also very often through the traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous people. And you can definitely see that with the bison pretty close to us here, the trumpeter swan up in the Flathead Valley. There is a lot of technique and wisdom and expertise that indigenous people bring to this table. And there's something else that I want to put on the table here. And I'm sort of taking off my Montana hat here and putting on my UK hat. So I grew up here in the southeast corner of England in Sussex. That is about 1.5 miles from where my parents live. And every time I go there, I go take a walk around here and look at the Seven Sisters. It's a really wonderful part of the country, but it's a very humanized part of the country, a very busy part of the world. And that's typical of the whole of Europe there in that map that I've got. You've got pretty dense sorts of human populations. In fact, we can quantify that density a little bit. In Europe, you have half the land area and you have double the human population. So by a factor of 4, Europe is more densely populated than the United States. So remember that factor, a factor of 4. And yet Europe has twice the number of wolves as the continent, the lower 48 of the United States. So I'm excluding Alaska here, but let's just count the lower 48. Europe has twice the number of wolves. The United States has somewhere around 6,000 if you add up the Rocky Mountain populations, the upper Midwest populations. Europe has around 12,000 wolves. And this map of the recovery of wolves, the blue basically, the dark blue is where populations had remained established over the last century or so. The light blue is where populations are starting to reestablish themselves. And populations have continued to move to the west. And I've circled the Netherlands and Belgium here because I think there are particularly interesting cases. Populations are now in the Netherlands and Belgium. They're in France. In fact, wolf populations heading up through France from Italy. So imagine a wolf from that block, pretty much bottom center of the picture, coming up through France, meeting the sea, turning right, heading up into the Netherlands and Belgium. Wolves from Italy are now meeting and breeding with wolves that have come from Russia and Poland. So these wolves have come from the top right of the picture, or the middle right of the picture, and headed through Poland and Germany and into the Netherlands and Belgium. So those two populations are now breeding with each other. Wolves are now in every country in Europe except for the United Kingdom. In Belgium now for the last 1.5 years or so, this one wolf was actually tracked. The first wolf in Belgium was tracked from near Berlin through the Netherlands into Belgium, found a mate, got pregnant. The mate was killed, unfortunately. The rather disgruntled male that was left trotted around, unable to find a mate for a few months. In the course of trotting around, managed to kill and eat a kangaroo out of somebody's garden in Belgium, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to happen in Belgium, a wolf killing a kangaroo, but eventually found another mate and bred in Belgium for the first time. And I want you to look at the landscape. This landscape actually, I didn't have any Belgium pictures, but I had a couple of Italy pictures. And there's actually way more wolves in Italy than there is in Belgium. But look at the landscape. These wolves are not living in the mountains. They're not living in completely wild areas. They're living in agricultural areas in and amongst people. So remember, twice the human population, half the land area, twice the wolves, and look where they're living. It's not just wolves that would surprise you about Europe. Brown bears. Europe has its own brown bear. There are 17,000 brown bears in Europe. That compares to a little bit under 2,000 in the United States. 17,000 brown bears in Europe, a little bit under 2,000 in the United States. Again, I'm talking about the lower 48 of the United States here. Another recovery in Europe is the bison. And these bison they're not back in the kinds of numbers that North American bison are, but they're back in growing numbers. And even they're going to be reintroduced to England next year. So that little red arrow is pointing to a part of England called Kent. And there's a site there where bison are going to be reintroduced in 2022. I actually visited the site recently, and they've just hired the first 2 bison rangers ever hired in the UK. I mean, literally through the whole of English history, there has never been a bison ranger hired in the UK. They've just hired the first 2 bison rangers for these bison that will be returned in 2022. So you've got the possibility for animals living amongst people on these very densely populated landscapes. Let's just flip back to the United States for a second and just think about where we might allow animals like wolves, for example, to live in the United States. Here's a projected map of where wolf populations currently are. So the light green is where wolves currently are. The dark green is where it's thought that wolves could live. So we've got, the upper Midwest, we've got the Northeast, we've got the Rocky Mountains, we've got the Cascades, we've got the Sierras. Did anybody think wolves might live on the Central California coast? Not really, not when they drew this map. No one was thinking of wolves living on the Central California coast. And yet, in April of this year, there was a wolf living on the Central California coast. This was an Oregon wolf with a radio collar that was tracked. It came down into Yosemite and then popped out, crossed the Central Valley, headed to the coast, and spent several weeks bopping through different counties in the Central California coast. So this poses this question, I think, of just how willing we might be or could be to live amongst wild animals. So here's a couple of questions for us to close on. And I just looked at my watch. I see I've gone over a little bit here. Can we focus not on what is difficult and painful about living alongside wildlife, but what is beneficial economically, ecologically, and psychologically? Are there innovative ways that technology will allow us to coexist with animals in ways that we didn't before? So this is not 1895. It's 2021. Are there new ways of living, coexisting with animals? And can we write a different story? Can we change that story of decline to one of resurgence and recovery? Those are the things that I think are worth thinking about. Thanks everybody for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask any questions or comment on these 3 questions that Christopher brought up for us?
Does Europe have the conflict on wolves like the United States has the conflict on wolves?
So it's really interesting, actually. There is some conflict. There's definitely some conflict. There's no farmer that enjoys having their sheep taken away. But the conflict is not so great because the government is playing a large role in trying to set the conditions for cohabitation. So a lot of money is being put into, setting up preventative measures and defenses, with the idea that if you can keep the wolves eating their natural prey, and in the Netherlands and Belgium, there is a huge overpopulation of deer and wild boar. And the government is spending hundreds of thousands of euros every year killing deer and wild boar to reduce crop damage. They're thinking if you can keep the wolves focused on the natural prey through these preventative measures, you can more or less keep people happy. The other thing that I think is perhaps a little bit different is you've got these large urban populations in Europe who want to see wolves on the landscape. And so there's a lot of sort of political energy coming from those urban centers that is being taken seriously on this issue. And there's interesting innovations like groups from cities volunteering their time on weekends to put electric fences up on ranches. There's an organization called Wiki Wolves in Germany, putting in the time and the hours to create these defenses for farmers. So, you know, I'd be misleading you if I said there's no conflict and no tension. But I think the conflict and tension is not quite what it is here. For various reasons, it's taking a different form and it's not quite as contentious.
I have a question for you, Christopher. Is there any species of wildlife, you know, it could be in the US or in the world, that is declining or close to getting that extinction level, that you're hoping to see come back in the near future? Is there anything in particular like you've been watching?
Well, I'm keeping my eyes on the UK, just because that's where you know, I've spent more than half of my life in the US. But I'm sort of really watching and interested in what's happening in the UK, given how densely populated it is. And I've got my eyes on the lynx. So that the lynx, there is enough habitat for the lynx in the UK. There's enough prey for the lynx in the UK. There's deer populations have been growing for the last 50 years. So there's enough habitat, there's enough prey. And there's also not quite the sort of ugly debates that an animal like a wolf is an animal that sort of presses buttons. A lynx doesn't press buttons in the same way. People don't feel at risk from lynx, and I think can recognize that they would add something to the landscape. And so there's been a proposal to reintroduce lynx to the northern part of the UK. I actually just learned, I was just talking to some people in the UK who are in the process of reintroducing wildcats to the UK. So a wildcat is like a small bobcat. It's not the same as a bobcat, but it's a little smaller. It has a long bushy tail. And they think they've got a better chance of reintroducing wildcats first, and then maybe lynx afterwards. But I think that would be sort of interesting to have a sort of meso-sized predator on the UK landscape again.
Any other questions or thoughts from the group?
So your lynx idea has a conflict in America because they need snowshoe hares and virgin forest. And as those two things vanish with human habitat, how are you going to keep the lynx surviving?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think the prey problem in the UK for lynx is not there, because, you know, the lynx in the UK don't depend on snowshoe hare. They eat small deer and rabbits. And there's no problem with those. There's plenty of them right now. And the UK is an interesting case for forest cover because forest cover is set to increase. So obviously, you know, historically it's been a heavily logged country, but it's a little bit like the northeast of the United States. The periods of great deforestation have ended, and so forest cover is increasing in the UK. And particularly, they're focusing very much on, you know, diverse ancient woodlands, trying to restore the original types of woodlands rather than pine plantations. You know, there's a period where there was a lot of pine planting in northern England and in Scotland. That's fading away. So the sort of the future possibilities in the UK are actually sort of interesting and heading in the right direction. Obviously, climate change creates, that's the sort of umbrella type of threat for any of these sorts of projects. But certainly the prey issue and the habitat issue in the UK for lynx might be more positive than you would think.
Righty. Oh, go for it.
Hey, it's Warren. I'm just curious, with the political climate today in Idaho and Montana, the wolf laws seem to be getting reversed and they're losing protection. And wondered if you see that as a long-term trend or if this is just a short-term anomaly. But I know both Idaho and Montana are looking at reducing the protections for wolves and actually hiring people to go out and shoot wolves to reduce the numbers. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting fact that there are less wolves in the Northern Rockies now than there were in 2012, in the sort of 2012, 2015, before some of the federal protections went away and before hunting and trapping started again, that there were more wolves than there are now. So yeah, you know, that's definitely food for thought, because, you know, there's an ecological carrying capacity and a social carrying capacity. And so we are, you know, we have to ask, all right, what is our social carrying capacity? The thing, you know, I'm not much of a, I don't come at this from a political angle or even from a wildlife biology angle, but from a philosophy angle. And as a philosopher, so what I think about that is what drives that hostility is a certain attitude towards wildlife and a certain attitude towards wolves. And, you know, attitudes are social constructs that evolve out of a particular history. And they tend to, those social contracts tend to get kind of reinforced and made more and more concrete and more firm over the years. And as a philosopher, I have to ask the question, are there ways to change that construct such that it is to the advantage of the wolf? So are there ways to change the story? And, you know, I think one of it takes decades, you know, it takes generations, but I just wonder if there are possible ways to change the story. And the wolf in Europe, you know, one part of the story of the wolf in Europe, I'm sorry to go back to Europe, but I think it's instructive here. If you can look at the wolf as saving you all that money that you had to spend on controlling deer and wild boar populations in order to make agriculture profitable, if you can look at the wolf as saving you that money, suddenly this animal is not just a pain in your neck, it is doing you a favor. And so I wonder if there, in the North American context, if there is a way over many years to shift the construct we have around wolves and think of them not just as a pain in the neck, but as something that does us certain favors. That's my optimism as a philosopher, a change in the way we think about wildlife.
Great. Thank you so much, Christopher. And thank you guys for asking questions. Those are really interesting questions. And once again, yeah, very hopeful ideas for the future, as somebody commented. We do have one question down here. I've encountered the argument, well, it's just a fish when talking about dam removal. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I had a conversation similar to this last week, where, so this was, I had a conversation with the guy who's managing the project to reintroduce bison in the UK. And he was sort of asking rhetorically, do we, why do we do this? Like, is it going to do anything for us? Or is it just like a lot of money, and what do you get out of having half a dozen bison here? Why do we do this? And the first thing he said, which I was sort of surprised at, because his background is in land management and agriculture. But I was kind of surprised that his first reaction was to say, it's the right thing to do because they belong here, period. So that's an intrinsic value type of argument. It's the right thing to do because they belong here. And then the follow-up argument is there's also a lot of ecological services and ecological benefit that this animal can provide. So, that there's, as a philosopher, you look at these as two different strains of argument. One is for the animal itself, because it's the right thing. And the other is for the benefits it provides to the system and the benefits it provides to us. And they're two sort of different lenses, but those lenses can both kind of work together. And I think, with a fish, it's the same thing. You can look through those two lenses and you can say it belongs here, so it's the right thing to do. But you can also say, this fish plays a role in sustaining the health of an ecosystem, and for some fish, sustaining cultural health and rebuilding cultural health and cultural relationships. And so you can very quickly start finding a lot of services or uses that animal provides, which some people find those arguments more compelling than the ones that say it's just the right thing to do.
Great. All righty. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Christopher. That was really interesting. I took some notes because we talk about wildlife all the time, and people ask, why do we have so many species in certain places? And so this is just a really helpful program, but also just really inspiring at the same time. And thank you all for joining us as well. If you have any thoughts or feedback for our storytelling program this year, please send them to Molly Stockdale, who has always sent you guys your emails every week. And then she and I talk about those sort of things when we're planning programs. And just look forward to more Zoom programs this coming fall. We're going to take a break from Zoom for a couple of months through the summer season because we are doing some in-person programming here in the park. So if you're interested in seeing what we're doing here at Travelers Rest State Park for the summer, go to travelersrest.org, and our events are on there. So thank you, and also our Facebook page. So thank you guys all for coming, and thank you, Christopher. That was really very interesting and very inspiring and very thoughtful.
Pleasure. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Have a great day.